20 years. It's been since the time that I took that first drug until now. I'm 6 years off. Actually, today is my 6 years off anniversary. So, 20 years. Just think of how much life I missed because I was so medicated. I was not in tune with my body or what it needed because I believed this false narrative about myself that I was disordered, my brain was ill, and I needed to take a pill for that. And I needed to see lots of professionals for that. And it turned out to all be wrong.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey, Hilda here. A waitress who was going to college and trying to manage her insomnia. A veteran who was deployed in the Iraq War dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome. A teenager with an eating disorder. All three of these individuals sought professional help for their mental health concerns, and all three were medicated. They each found it to be counterproductive and actually detrimental to their mental and physical health. This is episode 359, and our guest today are producer Wendy Ractliffe of the documentary Medicating Normal, and Angie Peacock, the veteran I mentioned just a moment ago, who is now a mental health reform advocate. Today, they both help us understand what's happening on the ground with mental health treatment and medications. Why are so many prescribed? Do these meds help in any way whatsoever? What are the drawbacks that come with mental health medications in particular? And if patients want to go off of the meds, what is that process like? And if we are not going to treat mental health conditions with prescribed medications, what can we do instead? These are some of the topics we touch on. Wendy and Angie shed light on all of the above, and they tell stories, their own and those of others, that help us understand the reality of our over-medicated mental health system. Before we get into the conversation, I want to invite you to some upcoming Weston A. Price Foundation events. Sally Fallon-Morell, the president of the foundation, is speaking about the contagion myth in Berkeley Springs in early April. Then she's offering a talk on nourishing diets on her farm in Maryland on May 1st. The following weekend, on May 7th, I'm hosting an event with Sally, Del Bigtree, and Joel Salatin at Polyface Farms in Swoop, Virginia. Go to westonaprice.org/events for details on any of the above and for registration info. I hope to see you this spring. And Redmond Sea Salt. I can't say enough good things about Redmond. The minute I tried their salt, I was hooked. It's unrefined, ancient sea salt with a complete blend of minerals and a subtle sweet flavor unlike any salt on earth. Plus, unlike a lot of salts on the supermarket shelf, it comes with a single traceable source, an ancient seabed near Redmond, Utah. Honestly, it's the way salt was meant to be. And Redmond, my favorite salt company, is offering Wise Traditions podcast listeners a special discount to try them out. Head to redmond.life and use the code word WISE for 15% off at checkout. That's redmond.life and the code word WISE for 15% off. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Wendy and Angie.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
I saw your movie and I found it so compelling. That's why I wanted you to be a part of this mental health track that we're doing on the podcast right now. I want to start, Wendy, with you. Tell us the story of that beautiful woman, Shalimar, who was in the movie, who was simply struggling with insomnia. What happened?
Yeah, so Shalimar was working as a waitress while she was going to college, and she is an African American who came from Jamaica. So she was working nights and she was having trouble sleeping, and she just told her doctor, and she ended up getting put on it started out with one medication to sleep, and that led to all sorts of bad side effects. And at one point she was put on a second medication for those side effects, and it really ended up derailing her life. She didn't finish college, and she ended up spending years in withdrawal when she finally realized that these drugs were harming her and impacting particularly her thyroid. So, yeah, it was really a catastrophe. And it all came from that first prescription for a sleep issue.
The doctor who prescribed that sleep medication just to help her get better sleep, was he not aware of the side effects?
Well, that's a good question. In the film, she goes back to that doctor with a hidden camera. We have his face disguised. And she asks him, and he is kind of quite honest, actually. He says, well, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And she says, well, I asked you if I could stop this medication anytime I wanted. I asked you if it was addictive, and you told me that I could stop when I wanted and that it wasn't addictive. And then he responds, well, yes, you can stop, but it might be very hard to get off of, which is what she experienced. So, to answer your question, I think the doctors are trained to believe that the side effects are minor and I guess possibly worth it because the drugs are supposedly so needed. But in fact, as we know, sleep medications never really work and there's a very high cost. And it's really lifestyle changes that people need to work on for sleep, lifestyle and diet.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I do hope that we can offer some solutions and some helps for folks. It sounds like right off the bat, we need to proceed with caution when we are prescribed medications. Angie, you know more about that firsthand. Tell us a little bit about your story.
So I was in the United States Army for about 7 years, and I had one deployment to Iraq. And basically, I went through so much trauma that, of course, I came back affected by that trauma. And when I sought, quote unquote, help, the help that I received was medications over and over and over, which basically was 13 years of my life, taking every medication that they told me to take, going to therapists, going to doctors, and then having more symptoms come up and then being told, oh, that's your mental illness. Now you really need medications. And finally, I listened to my own inner voice that said, like, something is wrong here. And I decided to come off of everything. But that last medication that I was on that was considered a low dose, I wasn't addicted to it. It almost cost me my life. And then this film was being made and they kind of found me online in support groups and they followed my story for a few years. And I'm one of the subjects in the film Medicating Normal.
But Angie, how was it that last med almost took your life? You said it wasn't addictive. What was it about that med that was bringing you so close to the edge?
Well, I guess the thing that they don't tell patients is that psychiatric drugs are physiologically dependent. And there's a difference between addictive and physiological dependence. Basically, the difference is I wasn't running out early. I wasn't craving it. I wasn't standing on the corner buying an antidepressant. I was taking my medication exactly as prescribed at a low dose, under medical supervision, attending all my appointments, not having any euphoria or anything like that. And basically what it does is all those medications change the way that your brain and body work. And when you stop taking them, your brain and body don't know what is going on, especially after you take them for a long term. So that was something I wasn't told. I tapered off under the direction of a doctor, and I come to find out later that he took me off completely the wrong way. Even though it was somewhat slow and measured, my body just had adjusted to that dose of medication over the course of many years, and I don't know if I'll ever return back to the way I was. They do damage.
Wow. And so I'm so glad you all are shedding light on this because I feel like, and this is not just a feeling, as I understand it, 1 in 5 Americans is on some kind of psychiatric drug, but maybe they're not aware of how addictive these are and how they do damage, as you said, Angie. What do you think, Wendy?
Yes, I mean, it's a huge problem. And I hear stories, practically every week from someone who had a bad experience with a psychiatric drug. Yes, they're way overprescribed. What's really striking to me is when people go in a way, a psychiatric drug, which is a prescription medication, and which, as Angie points out, changes the chemistry of your brain and can actually seems to make neurological changes. So sort of hardwired changes that can be very hard to reverse. So before people go on a drug like that, you would think they would try all the other options. So if someone comes in with anxiety, like, why not try yoga, try more exercise, try eating more healthy fats and cleaning up your diet? do all those first and only go to a drug as a last resort, if at all. But in fact, doctors really give out these drugs like candy to children, adults, pregnant women. It's pretty shocking.
And it's so common. I'm thinking about a moment I had in the parking lot of a Target the other day. I heard a kid kind of screaming or, making some noise. And one of the siblings, I presume, turned to the mom and said, "What's wrong with Henry?" And she's like, "Oh, he's crazy. He needs to be medicated." And I was shocked. I was like, what? I didn't know if she was really speaking from experience that he really needed to be on medication or if she was making an offhanded comment. But Wendy, because you've looked into this, how many children are on ADD and depression drugs and so forth?
I think something like 1 in 10 children is on a psychiatric medication. And yes, it's very disturbing. I mean, the ADHD drugs, they're stimulants, they're uppers. They are chemically identical to what's called speed on the street. And yes, in the short term, they help people's focus. In the long term, research has shown they have no effect on school success. So the children that get these drugs don't do any better than children with the same diagnosis of ADHD who never get the drug in the longer term. And yet so many children are put on these drugs. And also, as you pointed out, a very disturbing tendency is that these drugs are now being used. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe, but it's true for what's called anger management. So a child who is angry or upset will be medicated. And they're basically given drugs that are heavy duty, what are called neuroleptics. They're just sort of very intense downers, which suppress the central nervous system and appear to calm down the child because they, in effect, make them into a bit of a zombie. But when you think that children are being given these drugs rather than actually having the issues in their life addressed, it's very disturbing. So yeah, for example, I think something like 30% of children in the foster care system are on psychiatric drugs, and it's usually to medicate away their behaviors, which are the result of the trauma and the chaos in their lives. So it's very sad.
Wow. Yeah. And speaking of trauma, so Angie, you went to therapy. It seems like you were trying things besides drugs, right?
Well, yeah, but at the beginning, it was drug only. It was drug only. And then I started to do therapy. And then I tried like biofeedback and I got worsening panic. Like anytime I would try to sit with myself, it was like I couldn't. And then it's like, okay, but is that from the drug or is that from my original trauma? And how do you even know?
Oh, it all got mixed up kind of.
Yes. But for me, what happened was I started taking the medication immediately. I was 2 weeks fresh out of Baghdad. I'm landed in Germany and they start prescribing me a benzodiazepine. The one I was taking back then was Klonopin. Its generic name is clonazepam. It's very commonly prescribed nowadays. I started getting worse almost immediately. Like I couldn't leave my room, like a little bit of agoraphobia. Loud noises were bothering me more. I couldn't sleep. And then they would say, well, see, that's post-traumatic stress. You need to up your dose. But looking back on what has transpired since then and what I've learned over the course of being in the film and the work afterwards, that was probably an adverse reaction out of the gate. And instead of taking away the medication, more were added. Then it was an antidepressant. Then it was a drug because you can't sleep. Then I started getting headaches. Then I gained some weight. Now I have some infertility problems, weight gain, headaches, irritable bowel syndrome, frequent urination. So then it basically ballooned into 18 drugs at the same time by 2006. And then it took me, like I said, almost 10 years to get off of everything. It was really hard.
And did you shuffle around from doctor to doctor too, or were you under the same care the whole time?
It was different doctors because I knew something in me knew this is wrong. Something is wrong. I don't know what it is. Because when you're going to the doctor and you're saying, I don't feel good, why don't I feel good? If I'm taking all these medications, I should feel great. I should have a job and a marriage and be raising children in my 30s like a normal 30-year-old. Why do I feel so bad? And I'm never leaving my house and I don't care about being social or sexual or anything. And so I knew something was wrong. But then when you go to the doctor, they don't say it's the drug. how could they? All their education and their livelihood is based on prescribing these medications. I think they think that they're doing what they're supposed to do. But anyway, so then it's like almost like this gaslighting that you're like, I know something's wrong. I don't know what it is. But then the doctor's telling me it's my mental illness or it's a physical, some kind of new illness. Now you have a migraine condition. Instead of like, well, let's look at your life. What are you eating? How are you sleeping? What are you putting in your body? Maybe we need to take something away.
Coming up, Wendy shares a story of a teenager with an eating disorder who was put on an antidepressant. The Morning Meditation for Women podcast. Imagine a day with less stress and more peace. I start my day with a number of rituals that help me start it on my terms. I spend time in prayer. I journal. I walk in nature. If your day starts with more chaos than calm, check out the Morning Meditation for Women podcast. It's a great way to begin your day on the right foot. They offer daily, short guided meditations to help you feel more calm and less stressed. I sometimes listen to them on the way to work. Morning Meditation for Women podcast makes it easy to start or jumpstart a meditation practice by just clicking play. It's free to listen to on your favorite podcast player and gives you 5 to 10 minutes of guided meditation every morning. These guided meditations are created with love for anyone who feels called to listen. And they're hosted by a friend of mine, Katie Kremitzos, who has a beautiful heart of gold. And it comes across in the meditations as well. You can get access to hundreds of free guided meditations now by subscribing to the Morning Meditation for Women podcast. Just search for Morning Meditation for Women on your favorite podcast player, subscribe, and press play now. Or go to womensmeditationnetwork.com/morning podcast. An optimal carnivore. Organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet, but they can be intimidating to prepare and hard to source. Optimal Carnivore makes it easy to get started. They take 100% grass-fed organ meats from New Zealand, freeze-dry the organs, and encapsulate them into convenient bovine gelatin capsules. They choose New Zealand because it is one of the cleanest environments on Earth, and the animals are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished, and free of hormones, pesticides, antibiotics, and GMOs. And since our ancestors would have eaten the whole animal, Optimal Carnivore created a unique blend of 9 different organs in their grass-fed organ complex, a powerful combination including beef liver, brain, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, pancreas, lung, and gallbladder. This is awesome because each organ brings its own unique nutrients to the table. It's a real nose-to-tail solution perfect for people on the go or those simply trying to develop an appreciation for organ meats. I take these supplements to help fill in the gaps in my own diet. And I love that Optimal Carnivore plants one tree for every product sold, which helps the environment. They offer a grass-fed organ complex, as I mentioned, a grass-fed bone marrow, and a grass-fed liver product. So go to Amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and use the code Weston10 to save 10% on all products. Amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and Weston10. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Your story reminds me of that of the young girl that you all focused on in the movie as well. Wasn't there a teenager who had an eating disorder, I think it was, Wendy? And it almost felt like she was also near the edge because the medications, instead of helping her situation, were making her worse.
Yes, and that's a very common situation that parents and everybody should look out for. She had an eating disorder, which is a real problem and can be dangerous. And she was put on an antidepressant, which is sort of an all-purpose go-to that doctors give you. There's no particular evidence that it actually does anything for an eating disorder, but she was put on an antidepressant and it caused her to have hallucinations. But instead of taking her off that drug and saying, this is a dangerous adverse event, we're going to remove this drug, they loaded on now a new drug for the hallucinations. They put her on an antipsychotic and some other drugs. And this is very common with people when they start going on to psychiatric drugs. You're taking Xanax for anxiety and it makes you tired. They'll add a stimulant to, make you come up. People end up on a cocktail of multiple drugs, uppers and downers, and one drug chasing another. And it's very, very harmful. And there's no research that supports using drugs in this way.
Wow, that's a big statement.
Yes, well, it's true that actually there's almost no clinical trials ever done on what's called polypharmacy, which is being on more than one drug at the same time. So although it's done a lot in practice, it's actually not been studied at all.
You know what that reminds me of? They used to say with vaccinations, they have mercury in trace amounts. So that's not really going to do anything to you. Well, first of all, a toxin is a toxin. But second of all, they will often bundle the vaccinations. You get 3 in 1, or there are several doses over a short amount of time, and there may not be a study showing the consequences of that heavy frequency of dosage.
Right. Yeah. Given that nobody just gets one vaccination, right? So there's always, children get many, many vaccinations. So yes, one would hope that the study shows that cumulative effect of the 72 shots that I think children get by the time they're 18, you would hope that there's good research showing that that's safe in terms of any adjuvants like mercury.
Right. Well, Wendy, what made you want to make this movie in particular? What made you want to make people aware of the fact that we are over-medicated as a population?
Well, it was really my co-director and co-producer, Lynn Cunningham, who has a dear family member who had been on psychiatric drugs, who is still on psychiatric drugs for 20 years. And at a certain point, Lynn realized that this family member seemed to have deteriorated over the years. She had started out as a Harvard graduate and an athlete and working full-time in Washington, D.C. And then she got put on one drug, I think it was an antidepressant, and it was sort of 5 years later, she was on 3 drugs, and 10 years later, she was no longer able to work and she was on disability. So at a certain point, Lynn wondered what was really going on. And at some point, she found a wonderful book called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker that was written about 12 or 13 years ago. And it got quite a lot of attention at the time. I think the New York Times editorialist David Brooke listed it as one of the 10 most important books of the year. And that book really looks at the overprescribing of psychiatric drugs. And he makes the case that we have actually created an epidemic of mental illness, which is much of it is being caused by the very drugs that are meant to be treating it. So Lynn found that book and then she passed it to me and we said, well, we need to make a film about this.
Wow. So it's one thing to do it like that from an outside perspective, kind of shining the spotlight on the problem and on these people. But Angie, I feel like it's much more vulnerable to tell your own personal story and journey. Why did you decide to go through with it and be in this movie?
Well, part of it was that Wendy talked me into it a little bit. It's a funny story, but she originally asked me and I said no, because I had already been in like a documentary about veterans years past. So I kind of knew the process and I had been behind the camera many times, just being an advocate and stuff. And I just felt like I'm on my deathbed. Like there's no way you're filming this. But she flew to St. Louis and we went for a walk. And then I just said, okay, she said, if you don't tell the story, who's gonna? And when she got out of the car and she closed the door, I thought to myself, okay, well, you can't kill yourself because you can't be in a movie. And then at the end of the movie, they say, Angie was a wonderful person, but she died by suicide, because that's how severe that withdrawal was. And I don't want to scare anybody, but for me, I was a pretty severe case. And suicidal thoughts were like a daily struggle for about 2 years coming off the drug. And like I said, it's not me. I didn't want to die. It was like my body and brain was so imbalanced from 14 years of psychiatric drugs. It just, So anyway, in a strange way, being involved with the film was very helpful to me, and healing and being able to talk about this whenever I want to, and having all the validation from the doctors that are in the film and the people that we meet, and having all these people say, me too, me too, me too. So I was glad to be a part of it.
Wendy, I'm thinking a little bit about success stories. I'm thinking, aren't there people out there who are like, I was so depressed and Xanax, let's say, lifted me out and I could function again and be with my family, at least from all the ads I see in the magazines, the people look so happy. There must be some success or these drugs wouldn't be still so popular.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So certainly when I was making this film, I ended up kind of talking to everybody I met or knew about psychiatric drugs. And I did hear a lot of people who would say, well, I've been on Zoloft for 15 years and I think it helps me. And I would often ask more questions. And what I generally learned from talking to many, many people, because I also heard many, many bad stories, and many people who kind of had a neutral story who would just say, yeah, I was put on Paxil and it didn't really do anything. So after 3 weeks, I stopped taking it. And who were okay, didn't have bad withdrawal. But the people that do well on the psychiatric drugs are usually people that are on one drug, not multiple drugs, and that went on one drug and never raised the dose, just stayed on that one drug for a long period of time. And often they'll say, well, I think it's helping me, and I don't want to go off it. Because let's face it, things like an antidepressant, it's not a happy pill. It doesn't make you happy all the time. But what it does do is sort of flatten emotion, and some people can find that helpful. So sure, there are people that can find a drug helpful. I would also say that certainly these drugs, like opiates, can be very useful in the short term. The opiates are great drugs if you've just had surgery, and to take it for 5 days when you're in extreme pain, great. It's the same for a drug like Xanax. If you have panic when you go to the dentist, yeah, take a Xanax. If your child has just been hit by a car and is in the hospital, and you've got 2 other kids at home and you need to take a drug like Xanax or Valium for a few days just to cope, by all means. The problem really comes when people take the drugs long term, and in particular, if they develop tolerance and have to keep going to a higher dose and get other drugs added in.
So I think it's good to recognize that there are pros and cons. But this reminds me a lot of situations where if you don't know the whole story, you can't make an informed choice. So Shalimar, for example, who didn't get the whole story from the doctor about how difficult it might be to get off the sleep medication, she made a choice based on the thought that she could stop any time. And it turned out to be quite a different experience, right? So the main thing is for people to go in with their eyes wide open.
I would definitely agree with that. However, there is a problem, which is that doctors can prescribe many, many drugs. One family medicine doctor came up to us after the film and he said, he thanked us for the film and he's like, I think you're right about these drugs, but he said, I can prescribe over 5,000 different drugs. I don't know the side effects of all these drugs. I can't give people informed consent. So that's one problem, is that a lot of doctors just don't know all the side effects. And then the second problem is that the pharmaceutical companies are very smart and they know that their customer is really the doctor as much as the patient. And they market the drugs to doctors. And the doctors don't have time to read all the latest medical research. They depend on the pharmaceutical company drug reps who present the new drugs to them and talk about the side effects. And no surprise, they tend to minimize the side effects. And so the doctors themselves are not well informed about the risks of a drug. However, they're very well informed about the possible benefits of the drug. So this sort of creates an imbalanced situation.
I understand, yes, because when I go back to those ads I was mentioning earlier that show a lot of happy people on a certain antidepressant drug, at the end of those ads or in small print in the magazine, there's a list of the side effects, but it's either spoken very quickly by the announcer on a TV ad or it's in very small print. So it is minimized. And I think that's a really good point to make. So Angie, I want to ask you now, because you have gotten off of this kind of psychiatric drug roller coaster that you were on. If the pharmaceuticals were not the answer for you, what were some protocols that helped you live that healthy life you were seeking?
Well, since I've been off, I've explored many more things, but I mean, even being on and off, I've tried many alternative and complementary therapies that were super helpful. Like diet is number one to me. Eating really good food, wholesome food. Don't be scared of fat, I do all of that. I'm out in nature a lot. I hike as much as possible. I've been doing lots of massage and energy medicine, acupuncture. Getting my circadian rhythm back on track was like number one. Watching the sun come up and watching the sun go down and eating within a certain window instead of gorging myself at night because I couldn't sleep like I used to. All these things, social connection, having a purpose, having meaning in my life, having really good friends that help me get through the tough times. Nowadays, if I have a panic attack, I don't go pop a Xanax like I used to. You just can't do that. My body is forever changed. So when I have a panic episode, I call a friend and I talk through it, or I ground myself, or I meditate, or I just let it run through. Like, okay, don't be afraid of your emotion. It's here. There's nothing I can do about it. Let's just sit with it and figure out what's going on that's making me feel like this. And I sort of become my own doctor, my own therapist, my own alternative medicine practitioner. It's the only way I can do it. I cannot take these chemicals anymore.
Well, you running through those various protocols just brought a smile to my face. It is so empowering, isn't it, to not rely on the pills and more to find a way to manage the scary bits differently.
Yeah. And I mean, if I look back, I should have done all of this from the beginning and I could have totally averted 20 years. It's been since the time that I took that first drug until now. I'm 6 years off. Actually, today is my 6 years off anniversary. So, I mean, 20 years, just think of how much life I missed because I was so medicated. I was not in tune with my body or what it needed because I believed this false narrative about myself that I was disordered, my brain was ill, and I needed to take a pill for that. And I needed to see lots of professionals for that. And it turned out to all be wrong.
Wow. It reminds me of a story Natasha Campbell McBride said at a Wise Traditions conference. She said, when your child has an asthma attack, we usually just reach for the inhaler. Why? Because that's what the doctors say to do, right? She said, you can actually hold your child close through the time when they're struggling breathing. They will get through it and their lungs will be stronger. But this is not the message we've been given. I'm not a doctor, so I'm just saying what she said, but I think it sounds not unlike what you were mentioning when you said when you've had a panic attack, you work through it. You kind of sit with yourself to calm yourself down. You learn a tool and then you become more resilient afterward.
That's so true because taking all those medications, I would have been the one that told you they helped me. They saved my life. I need them. Don't you dare criticize them. They are life-saving treatments. But I'll tell you, being off them, it doesn't just go to the side of depression and make you less depressed. It mutes your whole life. It makes me care less about everything. So now it feels good to be like more engaged with life and be interested. And I want to go out and I want to see things and I want to meet new people and I want new experiences and I want to feel everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. You do kick the can down the road. I was medicated for 13 years. So when I came off of that, I still had the grief to experience. I still had the trauma to deal with. It was all still there.
Well, I'm grateful that you stopped kicking it down the road and that you were willing to share your story with us and with so many through the movie. Of course, we'll have a link in the show notes to where they can go to the website and watch it, rent it, or buy it. And I know you guys are on PBS too, so I'm very excited. I'm going to have to wrap it up now, even though I want to discuss more things with you. One thing I just want to pose to you real quick, Wendy, is Angie just mentioned a lot of solutions, but I noticed in the movie you highlighted the problem and not the solutions very much. Why is that?
Yes. Oh, that's a good point. I think because it is a big enough issue and it's not a simple issue. So we felt that our film was really telling an untold story because the mainstream story is that there's lots of mental illness. Oh dear, you must go to a doctor for it. And the truth is they're going to medicate you. And we wanted to present the other side of what happens when you get medicated for your mental illness. Really, there should be a whole nother film about what to do instead of taking medication. And as Angie said, it's so much about empowering yourself and finding your own power to find solutions to whatever problems you're experiencing in your life and whatever challenges and whatever is preventing you from living a good life, that you can find those solutions within yourself and within your community. So that should be another film.
Okay, well, we'll be waiting for that one. I know it takes time, though, so we won't hold our breath. But hopefully you and your team or others will hear this and be inspired. But now I will wrap up by asking you both the question I often pose at the end. It can be something related to our conversation or just something that you do that you want to get out there. If the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do? Angie, let's start with you.
I would say, don't believe that you are broken. You are perfect the way you are. There are things happening to you right now that are lessons to learn from, not things to be medicated away.
Beautiful. Thank you. What about you, Wendy?
And I guess being very practical, I would say I do feel diet is sort of like the foundation for health. So I would say read wise traditions and learn about healthy diet and buy good food, learn how to cook.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm so grateful for both of you, really, for this movie, for your heart, and for getting this message out. The untold story is now told. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Angie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Our guests today were Wendy Ractliffe and Angela Peacock. You can find out more about the film that was made by going to medicatingnormal.com. They have the trailer there and other information on viewing opportunities. And I'm Hilda Labrada Gore, the host and producer of this podcast for the Weston A. Price Foundation. You can find me at holistichilda.com. For the transcript for this podcast episode, visit our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And now for a recent review from Apple Podcasts. My favorite podcast from Wit NP. Especially during these trying times, this podcast produces Carrero, conversation that nourishes mind, body, and soul. This is beautiful, Wit NP, and this is exactly what we're shooting for. So thank you so much for your review. And now I want to invite you to give us more than a review. Of course, you can go to Apple Podcasts and tell us what you think of the show. But I want to invite you to give us your purposeful testimonial. I'm going to be putting together an episode with your stories. How has the Weston A. Price Foundation Wise Traditions Way of Living affected your life for the better? Just go to the westonaprice.org website, go to the podcast page, and you'll see About the Podcast. Click on that section, and you'll see this little app there called SpeakPipe. There you can record your 2 to 3 minute testimonial. Always begin, please, with your name and where you're from, and then tell us what the Wise Traditions diet has done for you and your family. Thank you in advance, and thank you for listening. Stay well, my friend. Hasta pronto.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.